The wind in the Montana Badlands doesn't blow, it breathes. It's a living, breathing entity that snakes through the limestone canyons, carrying with it the scent of wild sage, freezing pine, and today, the sharp, acrid bite of burnt gunpowder and CLP. Quinn Vance lay prone on the frozen earth, unmoving. To a casual observer, she might have been a statue carved from the very rock she rested upon. But beneath the layers of insulated Arc'teryx gear, a highly tuned human machine was at work. Her breathing was slow, rhythmic, and shallow. Inhale, exhale, hold. Through the crystalline glass of her Night Force ATAC R7-35x56 rifle scope, the world was reduced to a singular, magnified circle. At the center of the reticle, a white-painted steel silhouette stood defiant against the jagged backdrop of the mountains. Distance: 1,500 yards. Quinn's cheek was welded to the adjustable stock of the Chaytak M200 intervention. The rifle was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, chambered in the devastating .408 Cheyenne Tactical. It wasn't just a gun, it was a mathematical instrument designed to solve complex physics problems where the solution was terminal. She glanced down at the Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter resting in the dirt beside her. The digital readout gave her the raw data she needed. Temperature: 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Station pressure: 25.12 inches of mercury. Humidity: 42%. The crosswind was tricky today, a full-value gust blowing from left to right at a fluctuating 8 to 12 miles per hour. But at this distance, wind and gravity were only the beginning of the equation. Quinn's mind, disciplined by years in the SEAL teams, processed the variables with the cold efficiency of a ballistic computer. She factored in the spin drift, the natural tendency of the bullet to veer slightly to the right due to the clockwise rotation of the rifling. She mentally calculated the aerodynamic jump. And then, there was the Coriolis effect. Because the bullet would be in the air for over 2 seconds, the Earth itself would physically rotate beneath the projectile during its flight. If she didn't account for the planet's rotation, she would miss her target by inches. In her line of work, inches were the difference between a mission accomplished and a flag-draped casket. Her gloved fingers reached up to the elevation turret. Click, click, click. The crisp, tactile feedback of the 1/4 MOA adjustments resonated through her fingertips. She dialed in the elevation, then adjusted the windage turret to combat the Montana crosswind. Dope is set, she whispered to herself, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Data on previous engagement. It was the sniper's Bible, a logbook of every shot taken in every condition. She settled back into the rifle, her eye perfectly aligned with the optic. She found the mirage, the subtle, wavy distortion of light rising from the earth. By reading the mirage, she could see what the wind was doing downrange, long before it reached the target. The heat waves were tilting at a 45-degree angle. The wind was steadying. Now came the hardest part, the silence between the heartbeats. Quinn's finger curled around the Timney trigger. The brake was set at a hair-thin 1.5 pounds. Beat, beat, pause. In that infinitesimal pause between the diastolic and systolic rhythm of her heart, when her body was entirely still, she applied rearward pressure. The rifle roared. A jet of fire and concussive force erupted from the massive muzzle brake, kicking up a storm of dirt and dry snow around her. The recoil punched into her shoulder. A familiar, bruising embrace. But Quinn didn't flinch. She kept her eye glued to the scope, watching the trace, the visible vapor trail the bullet ripped through the atmosphere as it broke the sound barrier. 1 second. 2 seconds. Impact. Even at this distance, through her electronic ear protection, she heard the faint, satisfying smack of 419 grains of solid copper-nickel alloy obliterating the white paint dead center on the steel plate. Center mass. A gravelly voice spoke from behind her. Quinn slowly racked the massive bolt back, extracting the spent brass casing. It flew through the air, landing in the snow with a soft hiss as the hot metal melted the frost. She didn't turn around. She knew the voice. "You're pulling slightly to the left on your follow-through, Spectre," Master Chief Elias Thorne noted, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he stepped up to her firing mat. "Barely a fraction of an MOA. But it's there. You're anticipating the recoil." Quinn engaged the safety and finally sat up, pushing her dark, sweat-dampened hair out of her eyes. She looked at her old mentor. Elias Thorne was a legend in the armories of naval special warfare. He had a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too many wars. He was the man who had taught her that a rifle never lies, that the steel and glass only reflect the soul of the shooter. The wind caught the trace right at the transonic zone. Elias, Quinn replied, her voice steady but carrying an underlying rasp. It wasn't the follow-through. It was the atmospheric density dropping as the sun went behind that cloud bank. Elias chuckled, a dry, raspy sound, still making excuses for gravity. Kid, you hit a 10-inch plate at nearly a mile. Most shooters would be cracking a beer to celebrate. You look like you're attending a funeral. Quinn looked back downrange at the distant silhouette. The satisfaction of the perfect hit had already evaporated, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight she carried in her chest. Elias was right. She wasn't just looking at a steel plate. This was the curse of the 1,000-yard stare. The military psychologists in Coronado told her it was PTSD. They said her brain was having trouble separating the civilian world from the sandbox. But Quinn knew it was something deeper. It was a ghost. Every time she looked through the scope, the Montana Badlands faded away. The snow turned to blinding white sand. The pine trees morphed into crumbled concrete walls. And the steel target became a man. A man standing on a balcony in a war-torn city halfway across the world, holding a detonator. It was the shot that had earned her the Navy Cross. It was the shot that had saved 20 Marines pinned down in an alleyway. But it was also the shot that had broken her. Because right before the bullet struck, a little girl had run onto the balcony. Quinn closed her eyes, trying to banish the memory. The phantom smell of cordite and burning diesel fuel clawed at her throat. She had made the adjustment. She had threaded the needle between the hostage and the target. The terrorist had dropped, the detonator unpressed. It was a mathematical miracle. But the sheer terror in that little girl's eyes as the supersonic round cracked past her face. That was the ghost that haunted Quinn Vance. It was why she had walked away from the teams. It was why she was hiding out in Montana, working as a highly paid, anonymous ballistics consultant for private security firms. She was trying to find peace in the cold, unfeeling math of ballistics. Numbers didn't bleed. Trajectories didn't cry. You're somewhere else again, Spectre, Elias said softly, his tone shifting from instructor to father figure. He knelt beside her, picking up the still warm brass casing from the snow. You can't shoot the ghosts, Quinn. They don't have a heat signature. Quinn let out a long breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. I know, Elias. I like the quiet out here. The math makes sense. The real world doesn't. She stood up, her joints popping in the cold, and began to pack up the M200. She wiped down the massive bolt with a silicone cloth, her movements practiced and reverent. Well, the real world is calling, Elias said, pulling an encrypted satellite phone from his heavy canvas coat. Or rather, your corporate bosses in DC are. They sent a data packet to my terminal. Said your secure line was down. Quinn frowned, slipping the rifle into its custom Pelican case. I turned it off. I told Aegis Security I needed the weekend to calibrate this JTAC for their new VIP detail. Apparently, they have a puzzle they need your eyes on immediately, Elias said, handing her a ruggedized tablet. Something about an anomalous logbook from a Mk13 Mod 7. A rifle they leased out to a high-end client. Quinn wiped her hands on her tactical pants and took the tablet. The screen illuminated her face in the fading Montana light. As she opened the file, her eyes scanned the raw ballistic data. Column after column of numbers, windage, elevation, barometric pressure, bullet drop compensator settings. To anyone else, it was just a spreadsheet of gibberish. But to Quinn, it was a language she spoke fluently. She was reading the sheet music of a sniper. Her eyes stopped on a specific set of parameters. She zoomed in, her brow furrowing. This is wrong, she murmured. What's wrong? Elias asked, leaning in. These dope entries, Quinn said, her voice dropping an octave, the stoicism returning to her face. The atmospheric data here, it shows a constant temperature of 72 degrees. But radical shifts in windage every few hundred yards. The wind is tunneling, speeding up, then dropping to 0, then speeding up again in a vortex pattern. Urban environment, Elias noted. Between buildings. Yes, Quinn agreed, her heartbeat beginning to tick upward. But look at the elevation dial. The shooter is practicing at a consistent 1.040 yards. Over and over again, they are adjusting for a very specific, sustained downdraft. You only get that kind of downdraft in one place. Where? Quinn looked up from the tablet. The cold Montana wind suddenly feeling a lot more sinister. A plaza surrounded by glass skyscrapers. The wind hits the glass and shears straight down. She scrolled further down the logbook, finding a hidden tab labeled, CB. Cold bore. Elias, Quinn said, her voice tight. Whoever this is, they aren't just target shooting. They've logged over 50 simulated cold bore shots. A cold bore shot is the first shot of the day. Before the barrel heats up and expands. It's the only shot that matters in an assassination. Elias's demeanor hardened instantly. The retired Master Chief vanished, replaced by the warrior. You think someone is mapping a hit? Quinn stared at the screen. The math was undeniably clear. The numbers told a story of meticulous, terrifying preparation. The ghost in her mind faded, replaced by a very real, very present danger. I don't think it, Master Chief, Quinn said, snapping the tablet shut. I know it. Someone is building the perfect ballistic profile. And at 1,040 yards. With this specific wind pattern, they aren't hunting deer. Quinn looked toward the eastern horizon, where the sky was already turning the bruised purple of twilight. Over 2,000 miles away lay the nation's capital. They're hunting in D.C., she whispered. And we need to find out who. The interior of Elias Thorne's workshop was a sanctuary built of knotty pine and steel. It smelled heavily of Hoppy's No. 9 solvent, black coffee, and the dry heat of a cast iron wood stove. Outside, the Montana wind howled against the reinforced glass. But inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic tapping of Quinn Vance's finger against the ruggedized tablet. She sat at a heavy oak workbench scarred by years of gunsmithing. Spread out before her were the disassembled components of a custom 1911. But her eyes were locked entirely on the glowing screen. You're burning a hole through that monitor. Quinn, Elias grunted. He was standing by the stove, pouring thick, sludgy coffee into 2 chipped ceramic mugs. He walked over and set one down next to her. Drink. You look like you're about to call in an airstrike. I might need to, Quinn murmured, taking the mug without looking away from the data. She opened the raw CSV file extracted from the Aegis security cloud server. It was the digital memory of a Mk13 Mod 7. The exact same sniper weapon system she had carried during her last deployment in Fallujah. Chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It was a workhorse, built on a Stiller TAC-300 action with a Lelia barrel. Capable of pushing a 220-grain Sierra Matchking bullet well past the transonic boundary. Modern sniper rifles didn't just fire bullets anymore, they generated data. The rifle in question had been synced to an advanced ballistic calculator and a weather meter. Every time the shooter had squeezed the trigger in practice, the computer had logged the environmental variables. Aegis leased this rifle out to a platinum-tier private military contractor for training purposes. Quinn explained, her voice dropping into the flat, analytical tone she used during mission briefings. They claimed they were doing high-angle mountain work in the Rockies. But the dope is a lie. Show me, Elias said, pulling up a stool beside her. Quinn expanded a cluster of data points. Look at the baseline telemetry. The station pressure and temperature remain remarkably consistent across 3 weeks of logging. Hovering right around 72 degrees. Low humidity. That's not the unpredictable weather of the Rockies. That's a controlled environment, or a specific, low-elevation urban setting during a stable weather front. Elias frowned, adjusting his reading glasses. All right, but look at the windage corrections. They're all over the map. One shot. The shooter dials in 2 MOA left. The next shot. 5 minutes later, they dial in a quarter MOA right. Then a massive shift. 4 MOA left again. Exactly, Quinn said, her gray eyes narrowing. Wind in the mountains swirls. Yes, but it has a rhythm. It follows the topography. These wind shifts are violent, erratic, and highly localized. She tapped the screen, bringing up a 3D ballistics modeling software she had custom-coded herself. She began feeding the logbook's wind data into the simulation. "Watch what happens when I map the wind vectors," she instructed. On the screen, a red line representing the bullet's trajectory stretched out to 1,040 yards. At 400 yards, the bullet hits a dead zone. Zero wind. Then, at 600 yards, it encounters a massive, vertical shear. A downdraft that forces the shooter to hold over an extra 1.5 mils. Then, right before the 1,000-yard mark, a brutal, high-velocity crosswind. Elias stared at the 3D model. His weathered face tightened as the geometry of the situation became clear. "That's a wind tunnel." "A man-made one," Quinn confirmed, her heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "You only see this specific aerodynamic footprint in a major metropolis. The dead zone is the bullet passing over a low-rise structure or an open park. The downdraft is the wind hitting the glass facade of a skyscraper and shearing straight down into the street. The final crosswind is the funnel effect between two massive buildings." Quinn took a sip of the bitter coffee. Though she hardly tasted it, the 1,000-yard stare threatened to pull her back, the memory of looking through a scope in a hostile city. Trying to read the wind by watching the dust kick up off a concrete balcony. She forced herself to stay in the present. The math. Focus on the math. "So, they aren't shooting in the mountains," Elias said quietly. "They're dry firing or using a suppressed sub-caliber device from a high-rise. Aiming into a city." "Worse," Quinn corrected him. She pulled up the hidden tab she had found earlier. "These are logged as actual. Suppressed .300 Win mag shots. They're firing live rounds. And look at the target size they're calibrating for." She highlighted a column labeled Target Dimensions. 10 inches by 12 inches. Elias read aloud. The blood seemed to drain from his face. "Center mass of a human torso. Or a human head, if you account for the margin of error at that distance." Quinn added grimly. "This shooter is meticulously calculating the exact holdovers required to thread a needle through a very specific urban canyon at 1,040 yards." She pulled her hands away from the tablet and rubbed her temples. The phantom smell of cordite teased her senses again. "I ran a topographical cross-reference," Quinn continued, her voice tight. "I took these wind shear patterns and ran them against the architectural layouts of major U.S. cities. New York, Chicago, Seattle. And nothing matched perfectly until I fed it the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's microclimate data for Washington, D.C. Quinn brought up a satellite map of the capital. She overlaid the ballistic trajectory onto the grid. The red line of the bullet path started from a cluster of commercial high-rises. Crossed over an open expanse of green. Threaded between two massive marble government buildings. And terminated exactly at a raised platform. "The National Mall," Elias breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "The wind shears match the exact architectural footprint of the buildings surrounding the Smithsonian museums," Quinn said, tapping the screen to emphasize the points of intersection. "The dead zone is the open lawn. The crosswind is the funnel between the Natural History Museum and the EPA headquarters." Silence descended on the workshop. Heavy and suffocating. The crackle of the wood stove suddenly sounded like distant small arms fire. "Quinn," Elias said, his tone dead serious, "who is speaking at the National Mall this week?" Quinn didn't need to look it up. The news had been playing on the radio in her truck all week. "The president. It's the Memorial Day address. Open air stage. Full crowd. Maximum exposure." Elias stood up slowly, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. "You need to call Aegis. Now, tell your handler to flag this to the Secret Service. The FBI. Whoever." "I tried," Quinn said, her jaw clenching. "Before I showed you this, I tried to call David Sterling, my point of contact at Aegis. It went straight to a secure voicemail. I checked the company's server logs. The file I'm looking at? It was deleted from their mainframe 20 minutes after I downloaded my copy. Someone wiped the trace." Elias stopped wiping his hands. He looked at Quinn, the realization dawning in his eyes. Aegis leased the rifle. If someone is using it to map a hit on POTUS, and Aegis is wiping the data, then the call is coming from inside the house. Quinn finished the thought. She looked down at her hands. They were perfectly steady, a byproduct of years of training to suppress the natural human fight or flight response. But inside, her instincts were screaming. This isn't just a rogue shooter, Elias. This is a sanctioned op. Someone with high-level clearance and deep pockets is orchestrating this. And because I downloaded that file. The sudden crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway outside cut her off. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was the aggressive, tearing sound of a heavy SUV braking hard. Then, the distinct, metallic clack of a vehicle door opening. Quinn and Elias locked eyes. In the SEAL teams, they called it the X, the exact point of an ambush. Right now, this cabin was the X. You expecting company? Quinn asked softly, her hand instinctively dropping to her right hip, where her customized SIG P320 was holstered. I live at the end of a 10-mile dirt road in the middle of a freeze. Elias replied, reaching under the workbench and pulling out a short-barreled Remington 870 shotgun. He racked a shell into the chamber. The mechanical shuck loud in the quiet room. I don't get Girl Scouts out here. Quinn slid off the stool. Her movements fluid and silent. The haunted look of the 1,000-yard stare was gone. Instantly replaced by the icy, hyper-focused gaze of Spectre, the Tier 1 operator. The math of ballistics was about to be replaced by the brutal geometry of close-quarters combat. Lights out, Master Chief, she whispered. Elias hit the breaker switch. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness, save for the faint, angry orange glow of the wood stove. Outside, the heavy footsteps began to approach the door. The hunt had come to them. The darkness inside Elias Thorne's cabin was absolute. A thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the room the moment the breaker was thrown. The only illumination came from the dying embers of the cast-iron wood stove, casting a faint, angry orange glow across the knotty pine floorboards. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that usually masked the approach of predators. But Quinn Vance's ears, tuned by years of combat in the most hostile environments on Earth, filtered out the wind. She listened to the microsounds. Crunch, a boot shifting on the frozen gravel. Squeak, rubber brushing against the iced-over siding of the cabin. There were at least 4 of them. They moved with the synchronized, fluid spacing of a Tier 1 element. No shouting, no chaotic scrambling. This wasn't a local biker gang or a pair of meth heads looking to steal tools. This was a dedicated, cleaning crew, highly trained, heavily armed, and sent with a singular objective: erase the data. And erase the analysts. Quinn crouched behind the massive oak workbench. Her breathing shallow, her heart rate intentionally slowed. The 1,000-yard stare was completely gone. In its place was the razor-sharp focus of an apex predator trapped in a cage. She drew her custom SIG Sauer P320 from her right hip Kydex holster. The tungsten-infused grip module felt perfectly balanced in her hand. She pressed the weapon tight against her chest, her thumb resting lightly on the manual safety. Across the room, hidden behind a stack of reinforced steel gun safes, Elias was a ghost. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there. The short-barreled Remington 870 shotgun leveled at the fatal funnel, the front door. A faint green beam suddenly pierced the darkness, slicing through the dusty air of the workshop. It was an IR, infrared, laser. Invisible to the naked eye but glaringly obvious if you were wearing night observation devices. Nods. They have night vision, Quinn calculated instantly. They own the dark. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, letting her pupils dilate as much as naturally possible. Then opened them. She had to rely on sound, memory of the room's layout, and instinct. A shadow eclipsed the faint starlight bleeding through the frosted front window. Peefed, peefed, peefed. The glass didn't shatter, it disintegrated. 3 suppressed subsonic rounds chewed through the window frame, the impact sounding like a heavy staple gun driving into wet wood. They were pre-firing the corners. Standard room clearing protocol. The heavy front door didn't get kicked in. The hinges were blown off silently by a linear-shaped charge. The door fell inward with a heavy thud. 2 silhouettes flooded into the room, moving with lethal grace. Green lasers danced across the walls, searching for heat signatures. Contact front. Elias roared, his gravelly voice shattering the tactical silence. Boom! The Remington 870 erupted. In the pitch-black room, the muzzle flash was a blinding, magnesium-white strobe light. It illuminated the cabin for a fraction of a second, freezing the scene in a terrifying tableau. The lead breacher took the full force of a 12-gauge .00 buckshot shell to the center mass. His heavy ceramic plates caught the brunt of it, but the kinetic energy, over 2,000 foot-pounds of force, lifted him off his feet and threw him backward into the snow. The strobe effect blinded the remaining attackers wearing night vision. Their nods would automatically gate out the bright light, but for one crucial second, they were visually compromised. That was all Quinn needed. She rolled out from behind the workbench, dropping into a kneeling position. She didn't use her sights at this range. It was all about proprioception and point shooting. She identified the second silhouette stumbling near the doorway. Bang! Bang! A classic double tap. The flat-nosed 9mm jacketed hollow points found the gap in the man's body armor, striking him just under the armpit. He crumpled instantly, his suppressed carbine clattering against the floorboards. 2 down, Quinn shouted, repositioning immediately. In CQB, movement is life. If you stay where you fired from, you die. A hail of suppressed fire chewed the oak workbench where she had been a second before. Splinters of wood showered over her head. A third shooter had entered through the rear mudroom. He was flanking them. Elias, back door, Quinn called out over the ringing in her ears. Elias pumped the shotgun, shuck shuck, but before he could pivot, a suppressed round grazed his left shoulder. He grunted, dropping to one knee behind the gun safe. Quinn's mind raced. The third shooter was in the kitchen area, separated from the workshop by a thin partition wall made of drywall and pine. She remembered the layout perfectly. The refrigerator was on the left, the stove on the right. She tracked the green laser beam sweeping across the ceiling from the kitchen. She visualized the geometry of the beam, calculating the angle back to the shooter's barrel, and then to his center of mass. She didn't wait for him to step around the corner. She aimed her SIG P320 directly at the wall. Bang bang bang. She dumped 3 rounds straight through the drywall. She heard a sharp grunt of pain, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the linoleum floor. Overpenetration was a liability in a civilian environment, but right now, it was a tactical advantage. Suddenly, the cabin fell dead silent. The acrid smell of burnt powder, vaporized blood, and splintered wood filled the air. Status, Spectre, Elias whispered from the darkness, his breathing heavy. I'm up, you're hit, Quinn replied softly, keeping her weapon trained on the doorway. Through and through, the old armorer growled, flesh wound, don't insult me. Quinn waited. 30 seconds passed, a lifetime in combat. She scanned the room, pieing the corners with her eyes. Nothing moved. She slowly stood up, her weapon at the high ready. She moved to the kitchen first. The man behind the wall was dead. 3 entry wounds grouped tightly in a 3-inch circle on his chest plate. 1 round had spalled and caught his throat. She kicked his weapon away, a highly modified SIG MCX Rattler with an integrally suppressed barrel. Expensive kit, not standard issue. She moved back to the front room. Elias had turned on a low-lumen red tactical flashlight, casting a bloody hue over the carnage. He was applying a tourniquet to his upper arm with practiced, one-handed efficiency. Quinn knelt beside the breacher Elias had blasted. The man was groaning, his ribs pulverized behind his shattered ceramic plate. She reached down and ripped the black balaclava from his face. He was in his late 30s, clean-shaven, with hard, professional features, no tattoos, no dog tags, utterly sterile. Who sent you? Quinn demanded, pressing the hot muzzle of her P320 against his unarmored collarbone. The man just coughed, a wet, bubbly sound. He stared at her, not with fear, but with the cold, resigned look of a fanatic who knew he had lost the game. Quinn holstered her pistol and began rapidly searching his chest rig. She bypassed the extra magazines and medical kit, looking for comms or a datapad. In one of the administrative pouches, her fingers brushed against something cold and heavy. She pulled it out and held it under Elias's red light. It wasn't a radio. It was a single, Fired brass casing. A massive one. Elias leaned in, his eyes widening. Is that A.408 Chaitak? Quinn whispered, her voice dropping an octave. She turned the casing over. The primer had been struck, but the brass had been meticulously polished. And there, etched into the side of the casing with a micro laser, was a tiny, stylized symbol. A skull superimposed over a wind rose. The air vanished from Quinn's lungs. The phantom smell of the sandbox. The burning diesel. The memory of the little girl on the balcony. It all came rushing back, hitting her harder than the blast from Elias's shotgun. It can't be, Elias said, his voice trembling for the first time since she had known him. He died in Helmand. The chopper went down. There were no survivors. Quinn clenched her fist around the brass casing until the sharp edges bit into her palm. The pain grounded her. The corporate conspiracy. The Aegis logbook. The assassination plot in D.C. It suddenly all made horrifying sense. The meticulous data. The obsession with wind tunnels. The 1040-yard math. It wasn't just some mercenary. He didn't die. Elias, Quinn said, her voice turning to ice. She stood up, looking out the shattered window into the freezing Montana night. The hunter had become the hunted. But the game was older than either of them realized. Julian Vane is alive, she said, saying the name like a curse. The ghost is back, and he's the one pulling the trigger in D.C. The adrenaline dump is a biological tax every operator has to pay. 10 minutes after the last casing hits the floor, the body realizes it's not going to die today. And the parasympathetic nervous system slams the brakes. Your hands shake. Your vision blurs. The cold seeps into your bones. Quinn Vance didn't let it happen. She suppressed the physiological crash through sheer force of will, forcing her mind to stay locked in the tactical reality. We have 20 minutes before their Overwatch realizes this team missed their comms check, Quinn said flatly. She stepped over the lifeless body of the breacher, her boots leaving faint, bloody tread marks on the knotty pine floor. Elias sat heavily on a wooden crate, his face pale under the red tactical light. He was tightening the windlass on a North American Rescue Cat tourniquet high on his left bicep. The bleed is stopped. It missed the brachial artery. I'm good to move. We're burning the cabin, Quinn stated. It wasn't a question. Elias looked around the workshop he had built with his own two hands, the racks of custom machined barrels, the milling machines, the history on the walls. He gave a slow, grim nod. Basement first. We take what we need. The thermite grenades are in the green ammo can by the stove. 10 minutes later, they were in the subterranean bunker beneath the cabin. It was a concrete vault, a secondary armory that Elias kept completely off the books. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and cosmoline. Quinn threw her tactical go bag onto a steel table. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bunker, she finally took a closer look at the brass casing she had pulled off the dead mercenary. Julian Vane, she whispered, tracing the microscopic skull and wind rose etched into the brass. JSOC said his little bird took an RPG over the Helmand River. They spent 3 weeks dredging the water. Found gear, found blood, but no body. They declared him KIA. Vane didn't die, Elias rasped, tossing a trauma dressing onto the table and reaching for a bottle of sterile saline. He ghosted. He was always a mercenary at heart. Quinn, even when he wore the trident. He didn't care about the flag. He cared about the physics of the kill. Quinn remembered Vane. He had been an instructor during her advanced sniper phase. A cold, calculating sociopath who viewed human targets as nothing more than flesh-based ballistic gelatin. He was a master of extreme long-range (ELR) engagements. Why leave the casing? Quinn asked, holding the heavy .408 brass up to the light. A hit squad comes to scrub my data. And the point man is carrying a customized casing from a dead Tier 1 operator? It's a calling card. It's a warning. Elias corrected her. He walked over to a massive, dial-lock steel vault set into the concrete wall. He began spinning the combination. He knows you consulted for Aegis. He knows you're the only analyst who would catch the anomaly in that MK13 logbook. He's telling you to stay out of his scope, Spectre. Or he's inviting me in. Quinn countered, her eyes narrowing. She walked over to a whiteboard on the wall and grabbed a dry erase marker. Think about the math. Elias, why use an Aegis least .300 wind mag to map the wind in DC? Why not just use his Chetak? Elias swung the heavy vault door open with a metallic groan. Because a .408 Chetak is too loud. Too distinctive. Even suppressed. The sonic boom of that massive bullet bouncing off the DC architecture would trigger every ShotSpotter acoustic sensor in the capital. Exactly. Quinn nodded, drawing a quick parabolic trajectory on the board. But it's more than that. It's ballistic bracketing. A 220-grain .300 wind mag has a lower ballistic coefficient than a 419-grain .408 solid. The .300 is pushed around by the wind much easier. Elias paused, pulling a heavy, olive-drab pelican case from the vault. A slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. I taught you too well. If he maps the urban wind shears using a lighter bullet that gets violently thrown off course, he gets the exact, magnified atmospheric data. And once he has that raw data, Quinn finished the thought, he plugs it into his Kestrel for the .408. The heavier bullet will cut through those same wind shears like a laser beam. The firing solution becomes an absolute mathematical certainty. He's guaranteeing a first round, cold-bore impact at 1,040 yards. A decapitation strike on the commander-in-chief. The silence in the bunker was deafening. The sheer, cold-blooded brilliance of the plan was terrifying. He's going to do it, Quinn said, her voice barely a whisper. The ghost of the little girl on the balcony flickered in her mind. But this time, she didn't flinch. The trauma was still there. A jagged scar on her soul. But anger was rapidly pouring over it like molten iron. Julian is going to pull the trigger on Memorial Day. Elias slammed the pelican case onto the steel table and popped the 4 heavy latches. Not if you break his line of sight. Quinn looked down into the case. Resting in the custom-cut high-density foam was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. It was a Mk13 Mod 7, but completely sterilized. No serial numbers, no DOD stamps. The chassis was a folding accuracy international axe, coated in a matte flat dark earth Cerakote. Mounted on top was a Nightforce ATAC R5 to 25 x 56 f1 scope. Secured in a spur mount. Attached to the Lelia barrel was a titanium SOCOM suppressor. I built this action myself. Off the books, Elias said, his voice dropping into a reverent tone. Blueprinted Remington 700 footprint. The bolt is hand-lapped. The trigger is a jewel. Set to exactly 1.2 pounds. It will print quarter MOA groups at 1,000 yards all day long. Assuming the shooter knows how to breathe. Quinn reached out and ran her hand over the cold steel of the bolt handle. The metal felt familiar, comforting. It was an extension of her own nervous system. You can't call this in, Quinn, Elias warned, his eyes locking onto hers. Aegis is compromised. If they have the juice to scrub data from a secure server and send a hit squad to Montana within hours. They have moles in the Bureau and the Secret Service. If you try to warn them, they'll just paint you as a rogue, PTSD-addled veteran and lock you up. I know, Quinn said, gripping the Mk13. She lifted it from the case, checking the chamber by instinct. Clear. I have to counter-snipe him. I have to find his nest before he takes the shot. It's a suicide mission. Kid, you'll be operating black. No overwatch. No QRF. No extraction. If you fire a suppressed .300 wind mag in downtown DC on Memorial Day, the Secret Service counter-sniper teams will hunt you down. Then I better not miss, Quinn replied coldly. She began breaking the rifle down, slotting the pieces back into the Pelican case with rhythmic, mechanical precision. Magazine out, bolt removed, stock folded. It was a ritual. Elias watched her, seeing the transformation complete. The broken consultant was gone. Spectre was back online. Listen to me, Quinn, Elias said, reaching out with his uninjured arm to grip her shoulder. His voice was thick with emotion he rarely showed. When you get into that hide, when you put your eye to that glass, you are going to see ghosts. You're going to see Fallujah. You're going to see Vane. Quinn stopped moving, looking up at her mentor. You let them fade, Elias commanded softly. In the scope, there is no politics. There is no past. There is no trauma. There is only the truth of the flight path. Trust the math. The rifle never lies. Quinn nodded slowly. The rifle never lies. 15 minutes later, a sterilized, matte black Chevy Tahoe rolled out of a concealed garage entrance hidden in the tree line behind the cabin. As the SUV chewed through the frozen Montana dirt road, heading east toward the interstate, a massive, dull whump echoed through the valley. In the rearview mirror, Quinn watched a column of blinding white fire erupt into the night sky. The thermite was doing its job, consuming the cabin, the bodies, and her past. She turned her eyes back to the dark road ahead. DC was 2,000 miles away. The clock was ticking. The hunt for the ghost had begun. Washington, D.C. in late May was a swamp, both literally and politically. The humidity hung in the air like a wet wool blanket, trapping the exhaust fumes of endless traffic and the sweet, heavy scent of cherry blossoms that had long since fallen. Quinn Vance stepped out of the Farragut West metro station and merged seamlessly into the sea of tourists and government contractors. She was the textbook definition of the gray man concept, wearing faded Levi's, a nondescript navy blue windbreaker, and a Washington Nationals baseball cap pulled low over her gray eyes. A scuffed JanSport backpack hung over one shoulder. To the casual observer, she was just another face in the crowd. To the Secret Service agents patrolling the perimeters, she was background noise. But beneath the unassuming exterior, Spectre was mapping the battle space. The National Mall was chaotic. Bleachers were being erected, miles of metal barricades were being interlocked, and massive arrays of speakers were being hoisted into the air. Memorial Day was 3 days away. The president's speech was going to be the largest open-air address of the year, a tribute to fallen heroes. And Julian Vane is planning to add one more to the list. Quinn thought grimly. She walked with purpose, letting her instincts and the memorized ballistic data guide her. She bypassed the Washington Monument, its white marble blinding in the midday sun, and approached the cordoned-off VIP section where the stage was being built. She found a spot near a hot dog vendor, perfectly positioned behind a thick oak tree. She bought a bottled water, using the transaction to casually scan the rooftops of the surrounding federal buildings. Counter-sniper teams would be up there on the day of the event, armed with SR-25s and custom bolt actions. But they would be looking for immediate threats, shooters within a 500-yard radius. Julian wouldn't be that close. He was a creature of extreme long range. Quinn unzipped the top pouch of her backpack just enough to expose the lens of her Leica Geovid Pro 32. It looked like a standard civilian binocular, but it housed a Class 1I safe laser rangefinder capable of measuring distances up to 3,000 yards with sub-yard accuracy, complete with an onboard applied ballistics calculator. She brought the binoculars to her eyes, pretending to admire the intricate stonework of the Smithsonian castle. In reality, she was shooting an invisible laser back toward the stage. Distance to podium, 300 yards. Not enough. She lowered the optics and began to walk, reverse engineering the flight path of a .408 Chaitak bullet based on the logbook she had memorized. She walked backward along the theoretical azimuth, her mind calculating the drop and the wind deflection. She crossed Madison Drive, 500 yards. She moved past the National Museum of Natural History. The wind hit her face, a sudden, sharp gust channeling between the massive stone facades. She pulled a Kestrel 5700 from her pocket, glancing at the digital readout. The wind was accelerating exactly as the Aegis logbook had predicted. The funnel effect was real. She kept walking, deeper into the city grid, moving away from the open green spaces and into the concrete canyons. 800 yards. The line of sight was getting tricky. DC had strict height restrictions on its buildings, meaning the skyline was relatively flat. To get a clear shot over the trees, the monuments, and the crowds, Julian needed elevation. He needed a specific angle of declination. Quinn stopped at a busy intersection in Penn Quarter. She was exactly 1040 yards from the stage. She turned around and faced the National Mall. Through the narrow gap between two modern glass office buildings, she could just barely see the American flags draped over the stage scaffolding in the distance. It was a keyhole shot, a window of opportunity no wider than a standard doorway, situated over half a mile away. "Where are you, Julian?" she whispered to herself. She raised the Leica binoculars again, ignoring the strange looks from passing pedestrians. She didn't look at the stage. She looked straight up, scanning the buildings behind her, tracing the trajectory backward from the 1040-yard mark. Her lenses swept over a row of luxury apartments, a bank headquarters, and a historic hotel. Nothing fit. They were too exposed, or the glass windows didn't open, which would mean shooting through a pane, a ballistic nightmare that would alter the bullet's flight path unpredictably. Then, her eyes locked onto it. 3 blocks behind her, rising above the modern architecture, was the bell tower of an abandoned 19th-century church. The property had been bought out by a developer and was in the middle of a massive historical renovation. The entire tower was wrapped in heavy steel scaffolding and draped in thick, black, breathable debris netting. It was perfect. The netting was designed to keep dust and masonry from falling onto the street. But for a sniper, it was the ultimate urban camouflage. The mesh would completely conceal a shooter from visual observation. More importantly, it would act as a baffle, dispersing the muzzle flash and breaking up the heat signature of the rifle's suppressor, rendering thermal imaging drones useless. Quinn ranged the tower. Distance from the bell tower to the stage, 1.048 yards. She calculated the angle. The tower was approximately 150 feet tall. The height gave the shooter a perfect, plunging line of sight that cleared the treetops on the mall and negated the curvature of the earth over that distance. Checkmate, Quinn breathed, lowering the binoculars. She walked closer to the construction site, analyzing the perimeter. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded the base. Security cameras were mounted at the corners, but they looked like cheap, motion-activated models meant to deter copper thieves, not Tier 1 operators. A padlock secured the main gate, but a man like Julian Vane could bypass it in seconds without leaving a scratch. She visualized his setup. He would infiltrate the night before. He would climb the scaffolding, avoiding the creaky wooden stairs inside the rotting tower. He would set up his hide on the top level, cutting a tiny, 6-inch slit in the black netting, just enough to push the muzzle of the Chaitak through. He would lie on a foam mat to insulate himself from the cold stone. His breathing synchronized with the sway of the tower in the wind. He had the perfect nest, a fortress of solitude suspended above the capital. Quinn stepped back into the shadows of an alleyway across the street from the church. Her heart beat with a steady, cold rhythm. The 1,000-yard stare threatened to surface, the phantom smell of Fallujah dust mingling with the DC smog. But she forced it down. She wasn't a victim of her past anymore. She was a weapon forged by it. Julian had the high ground. He had the perfect angle. If he pulled the trigger, the president would be dead before the sound of the gunshot ever reached the crowd. The supersonic .408 solid would cross the distance in just under 2 seconds. Quinn couldn't stop him from getting into the tower. She couldn't storm the building. He would hear her coming and disappear into the city, only to try again another day. If I can't stop him from taking the shot, Quinn thought, a dangerous, icy resolve settling over her. I have to kill him the moment he reveals his position. I need to shoot him through his own loophole. She turned her back to the church and looked out across the DC skyline. The counter-sniper needed a nest of her own. She needed a vantage point that had a clear view of the church tower, but was completely hidden from Julian's sightline. She needed to become the ghost that haunts the ghost. Quinn adjusted her baseball cap, pulled the JanSport backpack tighter over her shoulder, and melted back into the flow of the DC foot traffic. The hunt was no longer theoretical. The battle space was set. Now, it was just a matter of geometry, gravity, and who had the steadier hand. Julian Vane did not believe in God. He believed in Sir Isaac Newton. God was a concept created by terrified men to explain the chaos of the universe. Newton, on the other hand, offered laws, gravity, mass, acceleration. These were undeniable truths. You couldn't bargain with gravity, and you couldn't pray away kinetic energy. In Julian's world, physics was the only true religion, and he was its high priest. He sat cross-legged on the floor of a sterile, high-rise luxury apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, overlooking the Potomac River. The apartment was rented under a shell corporation, paid for in untraceable cryptocurrency. It was empty save for a single folding table, a high-end espresso machine on the kitchen counter, and the matte black Pelican cases spread across the hardwood floor. Resting in his lap was the chassis of a Chetak M200 intervention. To the uninitiated, the rifle looked like a prop from a science fiction movie. It was massive, weighing nearly 30 pounds fully loaded, built entirely of aircraft-grade aluminum and steel. But as Julian's long, surgical fingers traced the fluted barrel, he didn't feel cold metal. He felt the culmination of human lethality. He picked up a lint-free cloth and began wiping down the massive bolt assembly. The click and clack of the steel parts locking together was a rhythm that slowed his heart rate to a steady 50 beats per minute. Perfection, he whispered to the empty room. Julian's mind was a supercomputer that only ran one program, the ballistic trajectory. For this contract, the target was the President of the United States. To his employers, a shadow consortium of defense contractors and political exiles, the President was an obstacle to global restructuring. To Julian, the President was simply a variable, a biological mass of roughly 190 pounds, consisting mostly of water, bone, and tissue, that would occupy a specific geographical coordinate on Memorial Day. The real challenge wasn't the target. It was the environment. Julian stood up, leaving the rifle on its integrated bipod, and walked over to the folding table. Resting on the plastic surface was a digital precision scale, a brass powder trickler, and 20 meticulously aligned cartridges. These weren't factory rounds. Factory ammunition had a margin of error. And Julian despised error. He was hand-loading his own .408 Cheyenne tactical rounds. He picked up a monolithic, solid copper-nickel alloy bullet. It weighed exactly 419 grains. Its shape was a patented, high ballistic coefficient design that allowed it to slip through the atmosphere with almost zero drag. It wouldn't just break the sound barrier, it would shatter it. Remaining supersonic well past the 2,000-yard mark. Using a pair of tweezers, he dropped individual grains of Retumbo smokeless powder onto the digital scale until it read exactly 132.5 grains. 1 grain too few, and the bullet drops an inch low. 1 grain too many, and the harmonic whip of the barrel throws the shot wide. Sub-MOA precision required absolute obedience to the math. As he seated the bullet into the polished brass casing with an arbor press, a burner smartphone on the table buzzed. A single encrypted text message appeared on the screen. Montana crew missed final check-in. Local authorities report structural fire at target location. No remains identified yet. Julian stared at the glowing green text. A slow, terrifying smile crept across his chiseled, unreadable face. She was alive. Quinn Vance, Spectre. He had taught her everything she knew. Back in the SEAL teams, when he was the primary instructor for the advanced sniper cadre, she had been his finest student. She had the eyes, the steady hands, and the intellect, but she had a fatal flaw: empathy. She cared about the collateral damage. She cared about the little girl on the balcony in Fallujah. That empathy had broken her. It had driven her out of the military and into hiding. But Julian knew that true apex predators couldn't be domesticated. That was why he had instructed the Aegis hit squad to carry his custom-etched .408 casing. The consortium paying him millions thought he was just tying up loose ends by eliminating the ballistics analyst who found the logbook. But Julian had a secondary motive. A masterpiece meant nothing without an audience who could truly understand it. He wanted Quinn to know. He wanted her to look at the math, see the wind shears, and realize that the ghost had returned from the grave. He wanted her to come to Washington. "You survived the X, Spectre," Julian murmured, picking up the finished .408 round and admiring its lethal golden symmetry. "Elias must have helped you. But you can't stop what's already in motion." Julian walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of the apartment. Across the river, the monuments of Washington, D.C. glowed in the night. He had spent 3 weeks using a suppressed .300 wind mag to map every microcurrent of wind in that city. He knew how the thermal updrafts from the asphalt affected the bullet's drop. He knew how the humidity off the Potomac slowed the projectile. He closed his eyes and visualized the stage. Distance: 1048 yards. Angle of declination: 3.2 degrees. Time of flight, 1.87 seconds. When he pulled the trigger, the Earth would physically rotate 1.5 inches beneath the bullet before it struck. He had calculated for the Coriolis effect. He had calculated for the spin drift. He had even factored in the aerodynamic jump caused by the specific DC crosswind. He had chosen the abandoned bell tower carefully. The debris netting was the perfect cloak. He would infiltrate at 2 o'clock hours on Memorial Day. 12 hours before the speech. He would wait in the darkness. A spider in a steel web. Slowing his heart rate until he became a statue. The Secret Service counter-snipers on the rooftops would be looking through their spotting scopes. Completely oblivious. They were looking for men with guns. Julian wasn't a man with a gun. He was a mathematical equation waiting to be solved. But Quinn wouldn't be looking for a man with a gun either. She would reverse engineer the math. She would look for the perfect nest. She would find the church tower. Julian opened his eyes. His pupils dilated with the thrill of the hunt. This was the true game. A duel between the only two people on Earth who spoke the language of the 1,000-yard stare. She would come for him, trying to break his line of sight, trying to find her own vantage point to counter-snipe him before he could execute the president. "Come and find me, little ghost," Julian said softly to the glittering skyline. He turned back to the folding table, packed the 20 hand-loaded rounds into a custom foam block, and snapped the heavy latches of the Pelican case shut. The symphony was written. The instruments were tuned. All that was left was to play the final note. By 1 o'clock hours, Washington, D.C. had shed its skin. The throngs of tourists in their bright windbreakers were gone, replaced by the yellow glow of sodium streetlights and the distant, rhythmic wail of a police siren. The monuments were illuminated, standing like glowing white tombstones against the pitch-black sky. Quinn Vance moved through the shadows of the commercial district, 2 blocks west of the abandoned church. She had spent the last 6 hours calculating lines of sight. Julian's position in the church's bell tower gave him a godlike view of the National Mall. To counter him, Quinn didn't need to see the stage. In fact, she couldn't see the stage. If she had a line of sight to the president, then the Secret Service counter-sniper teams would eventually find her in their spotting scopes. She needed a blind spot, a position that looked only at the church tower, intersecting Julian's trajectory at a perpendicular angle. She stood in the recessed doorway of a brutalist 1970s-era municipal annex building. It was an architectural eyesore, a square block of poured concrete and narrow, slit-like windows. It housed the Department of Agriculture's overflow archives. More importantly, it was 12 stories high and exactly 620 yards from the western face of the church tower. It was the perfect counter nest. Quinn slipped a set of titanium tension wrenches and a rake from the hidden lining of her windbreaker. The magnetic lock on the service entrance was formidable, but the physical key override was a standard Medeco cylinder. It took her less than 40 seconds to pick it. She slipped inside, letting the heavy steel door click shut behind her. She bypassed the elevators. Elevators were loud, and their digital floor indicators were a dead giveaway to the night watchman sitting at the front desk in the lobby. Instead, she found the concrete stairwell and began the long climb. Her breathing was controlled, a steady 2 count in, 2 count out. The heavy tactical backpack dug into her shoulders, but she ignored the burn in her thighs. When she reached the 12th floor, she didn't stop. She climbed one more half-flight of stairs to a heavy, reinforced door marked mechanical, authorized personnel only. A simple swipe of a cloned RFID card she'd secured from a careless maintenance worker at a coffee shop earlier that day granted her access. She stepped into the elevator motor room. The heat was oppressive, and the air smelled sharply of ozone, hot copper, and heavy industrial grease. The massive, cylindrical elevator motors hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that rattled her teeth. It was deafening. Perfect, Quinn thought. The ambient noise of the machinery would completely mask the suppressed gunshot of her .300 Winchester Magnum. She moved to the eastern wall of the mechanical room. There were no windows, only a large, industrial aluminum louver, a ventilation grate designed to pull exhaust air out of the building. The slats were angled downward to prevent rain from getting in, spaced exactly 4 inches apart. Quinn dropped her backpack and unzipped it. Working entirely by the dim, red ambient light of the machinery status panels, she began to assemble the Mk-13 Mod 7 Elias had built for her. First, she unfolded the flat dark earth chassis. Locking the buttstock into place with a solid, metallic clack, she threaded the titanium SOCOM suppressor onto the heavy Lelia barrel, hand-tightening it to ensure absolute concentricity. Finally, she slid the massive bolt into the receiver, working it once to feel the glass smooth glide of the hand-lapped steel. She didn't use a bipod. The concrete floor was too low, and the angle through the vent was too high. Instead, she pulled a heavy canvas shooting bag from her pack, filled with plastic polymer beads. She wedged the bag onto a heavy steel conduit pipe running just below the vent, creating a stable, makeshift parapet. She rested the forend of the Mk-13 on the bag and brought her eye to the Night Force optic. Through the glass, she navigated the 4-inch gap between the aluminum slats of the vent. It was a terrifyingly narrow loophole. If she pulled her shot by even half an inch, the supersonic bullet would strike the aluminum slat, shattering the round and sending a spray of copper and lead back into her own face. She dialed the magnification up to 25x. The city grid snapped into crisp focus. There it was, 620 yards away, the church bell tower. Through the optics, the black debris netting wrapping the scaffolding looked like a solid wall of shadow. But Quinn knew the construction of that mesh. It was permeable. She dialed the parallax adjustment on the left side of the scope, focusing past the surface of the netting and into the darkness inside the tower. She couldn't see anything yet, but she knew where Julian would be. He would choose the high right corner of the belfry, bracing his rifle against the 19th-century stonework to maximize stability. Quinn reached up and adjusted her elevation turret. At 600 yards, the .300 Win mag would drop roughly 85 inches. She dialed in 3.5 mils of elevation. The wind was negligible at this altitude, blocked by the surrounding buildings, so she left her windage at 0. Her dope was set. The trap was laid. Quinn pulled a specialized, heavy-duty moving blanket from her pack and draped it over herself and the rifle, pinning the edges to the wall around the vent. It created a dark canopy, hiding any reflection from her scope lens and trapping the heat of her body so it wouldn't bleed out of the vent and be picked up by a passing thermal drone. Under the blanket, in the suffocating heat of the mechanical room, Spectre settled into the rifle. She checked her Luminox watch. 2:15 hours. Memorial Day. Julian would be making his move soon. He would infiltrate the church, climb the scaffolding, and carve his tiny window into the netting. And when he did, when he pushed the muzzle of that massive .408 Chaitak through the mesh to execute the commander-in-chief, Quinn would be waiting. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic thrum of the elevator motors wash over her. She thought of Elias, bleeding in his burned-down cabin. She thought of the little girl in Fallujah. She thought of Julian, his cold, mathematical arrogance. In the scope, there is no politics. Elias's voice echoed in her memory. There is only the truth of the flight path. Quinn opened her eyes. The 1,000-yard stare was back. But this time, it wasn't a symptom of trauma. It was a weapon. She welded her cheek to the stock, wrapping her finger around the trigger guard, and began the longest vigil of her life. The hardest part of being a sniper isn't pulling the trigger. It is the agonizing, bone-crushing reality of the wait. By 6 o'clock hours, Quinn Vance had been lying on the concrete floor of the mechanical room for nearly 4 hours. Her body was locked into a prone firing position under the heavy moving blanket. Every muscle in her neck and shoulders screamed in silent protest, threatening to cramp. The vibrating hum of the elevator motors beneath her had seeped into her bones, blurring the line between where the machine ended and the woman began. She didn't move. She couldn't. Slowly, without shifting her head, she bit down on the silicone bite valve of her camelback tube, drawing a mouthful of lukewarm water. Hydration was critical. Dehydration led to a spiked heart rate, and a spiked heart rate translated to a tremor in the reticle. At 620 yards, a tremor of 1 millimeter at the muzzle meant missing the target by feet. Through the louvered vent, she watched the city wake up. The sun breached the horizon over the Potomac River, casting long, bleeding streaks of orange and gold across the marble monuments of the capital. It was beautiful. It was the kind of morning that made people glad to be alive. A stark contrast to the cold arithmetic of death Quinn was calculating. As the sunlight hit the asphalt of the DC streets, the temperature began to rise. The oppressive humidity of the swamp returned. Inside the mechanical room, it felt like an oven. Sweat stung her eyes, but she blinked it away, refusing to take her hand off the pistol grip of the Mk-13 to wipe her face. Air density is changing, her mind calculated automatically. As the air warmed, it became thinner. The .300 Winchester Magnum bullet would encounter less drag and fly slightly flatter. She reached up with her left hand, moving at a glacial, imperceptible pace, and clicked her elevation turret down by 1/10 of a mil. She settled back into the glass. The black debris netting of the church tower was now fully illuminated by the morning sun. It looked solid, impenetrable. In the suffocating silence of her hide, Quinn's mind began to drift. It was a dangerous psychological threshold all snipers faced. When the sensory input is reduced to a single optic, the ghosts of the past come rushing in to fill the void. She thought of her sister, Sarah, living a quiet life in suburban Ohio. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. Quinn had tried. Once, after Fallujah, she had sat at Sarah's kitchen table, looking at her 2 young nieces playing in the yard, and realized she no longer spoke their language. She couldn't explain the smell of copper blood, or the way a human body drops like a sack of wet sand when the central nervous system is severed. She had left before dinner and never looked back. If I don't walk out of this room, Quinn thought, staring through the reticle, some guy in a cheap government suit is going to knock on Sarah's door. He'll hand her a folded flag and tell her I died in a training accident. She'll never know that I died in a boiler room, trying to stop a monster. A single tear mixed with the sweat on her cheek, tracing a hot path down to her jawline. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. It was the price of being the sheepdog. You lived outside the flock, out in the cold and the dark, fighting the wolves so the sheep could pretend the world was safe. By 9 o'clock hours, the National Mall was a sea of humanity. Through the narrow gap in the vent, Quinn couldn't see the crowd, but she could hear them. The faint, echoing roar of thousands of patriots gathering for the Memorial Day address filtered through the DC skyline. The distant sound of a military marching band tuning their brass instruments drifted on the wind. It was a celebration of life, built on the sacrifices of the dead. Quinn refocused her vision on the church tower. She dialed her night force optic to its maximum 35x magnification. The black mesh filled her entire field of view. She began a systematic, grid-by-grid search of the scaffolding, looking for the anomaly, looking for the predator. 10 minutes passed, then 20. At 9:45 hours, she saw it. It was subtle, so incredibly subtle that a Secret Service spotter looking for a rifle barrel would have completely missed it. High up in the right corner of the belfry, about 80 feet off the ground, the tension of the black netting had changed. Quinn stopped breathing. A perfectly straight, 6-inch vertical line had appeared in the fabric. The mesh had been cut with a razor blade. It wasn't flapping in the wind, it was held taut from the inside by something dark and metallic. It was the muzzle of Julian's Chaitak M200 intervention, receding just an inch behind the fabric, invisible in the shadows. "Got you," Quinn whispered, her heart giving a violent, singular thud against her ribs. Julian was there. The ghost was in his nest. He had survived the climb, set his hide, and cut his loophole. Right now, he was likely lying on his own mat, looking through his own scope, waiting for the commander-in-chief to step up to the podium. He had the perfect angle on the president, but Quinn had the perfect angle on him. She adjusted her crosshairs, placing the illuminated center dot exactly 1 inch behind the vertical slit in the netting. She wasn't aiming at the rifle. She was visualizing the geometry of the human body behind it. She calculated the position of Julian's head and shoulder as he welded his cheek to the stock. The trap was fully set. Now, they were locked in a lethal stalemate. 2 apex predators, suspended hundreds of feet in the air, separated by 620 yards of urban canyon. Suddenly, the encrypted police scanner application running silently on Quinn's burner phone vibrated against the concrete floor. A single, automated text-to-speech voice whispered in her earpiece. Potomac 1 is wheels down. Motorcade is on the move. ETA to the stage is 15 mics. The president was 15 minutes away. Quinn slowly slipped her finger inside the trigger guard. The 1.2-pound trigger rested lightly against the pad of her index finger. The long vigil was over. The math was done. Now, there was only the blood. The arrival of the President of the United States is not just an event, it is a seismic shift in the atmosphere. Even trapped inside the sweltering, windowless mechanical room 12 stories above the street, Quinn Vance could feel it. First came the distant, rhythmic chopping of the Marine One decoy helicopters sweeping the airspace. Then came the sirens, a synchronized wailing that locked down every intersection in a 3-mile radius. Finally, she felt the heavy, subsonic rumble of the Beast, the heavily armored Cadillac limousine, rolling onto the pavement near the National Mall. It was exactly 11:45 hours. 0 hour was approaching. Under the suffocating heat of the moving blanket, Quinn's body was slick with sweat. The thermometer on her Kestrel weather meter read 102 degrees inside the cramped space. But her hands, wrapped around the pistol grip of the Mk13 Mod 7, were ice cold and perfectly still. Through the 4-inch gap in the louvered vent, the world was a high-definition circle of magnified glass. She watched the massive crowd swelling across the green expanse of the mall. The United States Marine Band struck up, hailed to the chief. The brass instruments gleaming under the harsh midday sun. Her encrypted police scanner buzzed faintly in her earpiece. Eagle is out of the nest. Moving to the podium. All Overwatch elements. Report green. Rooftop Alpha. Green. Rooftop Bravo. Green. Monument element. Green. Quinn listened to the Secret Service counter-sniper, CS, teams checking in. They were out there on the surrounding federal buildings, peering through their expensive spotting scopes, armed with custom State Route 25s. They were elite, highly trained professionals looking for an assassin. But they were looking for a man. They weren't looking for a mathematical anomaly. Quinn shifted her crosshairs away from the stage and back to the abandoned church tower 620 yards away. The black debris netting hung motionless in the heavy, humid air. He's invisible to them, Quinn thought, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The Secret Service CS teams were scanning for open windows, rooftop parapets, and moving shadows. Julian Vane had chosen a hide that defeated visual observation entirely. The mesh of the construction netting absorbed light and blocked thermal imaging. He was a ghost, waiting to strike from a fortress of woven nylon. Down on the stage, the president stepped up to the bullet-resistant podium. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of applause. Red, white, and blue bunting fluttered in the breeze. My fellow Americans, the president's voice boomed over the massive speaker arrays, echoing off the marble facades of the museums. Today, we gather not just to remember the fallen, but to honor the weight of their sacrifice. Quinn tuned out the politics. She was a creature of physics now. She stared at the 6-inch vertical slit in the netting of the church tower. It was still dark, still empty. Come on, Julian, it's time to go to work. A sniper's greatest enemy is time. At 1,000 yards, a target can move, the wind can shift, the atmospheric pressure can drop. Julian wouldn't push his barrel through the netting until the absolute last second. He would minimize his exposure to a fraction of a heartbeat. Suddenly, Quinn saw it. It wasn't a flash of metal. It wasn't a movement. It was a distortion in the air itself. Through the 35x magnification of her Night Force optic, the crisp outline of the netting around the slit began to shimmer and dance. It looked like water running down a pane of glass. Mirage. Julian was using a specialized, large-volume titanium suppressor on his .408 JTAC. Even unfired, the metal of the weapon was colder than the sweltering ambient air trapped inside the unventilated stone bell tower. As he slowly edged the massive rifle forward to the slit, the temperature differential created a microclimate of heat waves pouring out of the gap. The Mirage told Quinn everything she needed to know. It told her the exact angle of his barrel. It told her he was locked onto the stage. A matte black cylinder, no wider than a quarter, breached the slit in the netting. It extended exactly 1 inch into the sunlight. The ghost had materialized. Quinn's heart hammered against her ribs. But she forced her autonomic nervous system into submission. She began her breathing cycle. Inhale deep. Exhale half. Hold. This was the respiratory pause. The sanctuary of the sniper. In this suspended state, the body is completely still. Starved of oxygen but free of vibration. She had exactly 6 seconds before her vision would start to blur and her muscles would tremble. She didn't aim at the tip of his suppressor. She used the geometric footprint of the Chetak M200 to calculate the position of the man behind it. From the tip of the suppressor, she traced an invisible line backward through the dark mesh. 30 inches for the fluted barrel. 8 inches for the massive bolt action. 6 inches to the adjustable cheek rest. She placed her illuminated red crosshair in the empty black space behind the slit. Right where Julian's right eye would be pressed against his optic. They gave their tomorrow, so that we could have our today. The president's voice echoed powerfully across the city. The crowd went completely silent, hanging on every word. The wind shifted. Quinn felt the subtle change in air pressure against her cheek through the vent. She glanced down at the mirage bleeding from Julian's hide. The heat waves were no longer rising straight up. They were tilting at a 10-degree angle to the right. A thermal updraft from the hot asphalt of the street below was funneling up the side of the church tower. Julian would see it too. He would have to adjust. Through her scope, Quinn watched the black tip of the suppressor track microscopically to the left. Julian was dialing in a quarter MOA windage correction to combat the updraft. He was perfecting his 10-48-yard firing solution. He's going to take the shot on the next applause line. Quinn realized. The sound of the cheering crowd would mask the subsonic crack of the bullet passing over the National Mall. We do not simply mourn them. The president continued, his voice rising in crescendo. We carry their legacy forward. We stand as the impenetrable shield of liberty. Quinn wrapped her finger around the jeweled trigger. The brake weight was 1.2 pounds. She applied 8 ounces of rearward pressure. The slack vanished. She visualized the internal mechanics of her Mk-13. The sear holding back the firing pin. The brass casing loaded with 220 grains of terminal fury. 400 yards away, Julian's finger was undoubtedly doing the exact same thing. 2 snipers, separated by a sea of oblivious humanity, dancing on the razor's edge of the trigger. Quinn applied 10 ounces of pressure. 11 ounces. She was looking through the glass, through the netting, through the darkness, straight into the soul of the man who had taught her how to kill. She saw the ghost of the little girl in Fallujah one last time. You don't get to take anyone else, Spectre whispered in the dark. The crowd drew a collective breath, ready to erupt into a massive cheer. Quinn's finger broke the 1.2-pound wall. The sear tripped. The firing pin struck the primer. Inside the sweltering mechanical room, the Mk-13 Mod 7 erupted, even with the titanium SOCOM suppressor. The violent ignition of 75 grains of magnum rifle powder in a confined concrete space was a concussive shockwave. The heavy rifle drove back into Quinn's shoulder. A brutal, familiar punch. A 220-grain Sierra Matchking bullet exited the Lelia barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second. It tore through the 4-inch gap in the aluminum louver without touching the sides, vanishing into the DC skyline. Time of flight to the church tower, 0.74 seconds. But as Quinn's rifle fired, the microscopic mirage bleeding from the slit in the black netting across the urban canyon vanished. It was replaced by a violent, expanding sphere of white-hot gas. Julian had pulled the trigger at the exact same fraction of a second. High above the National Mall, 2 supersonic projectiles crossed paths in the humid air, separated by hundreds of yards of altitude but bound by the same deadly intent. Quinn fought the recoil, keeping her eye welded to the Night Force optic to watch her bullets trace. She saw the vapor trail streak across the sky and punch a hole the size of a fist right through the black debris netting of the church tower. Smack! It wasn't the wet, heavy sound of a bullet striking center mass. It was the sharp, metallic crack of lead and copper obliterating high-grade optical glass and aluminum. Quinn had aimed for the empty space where Julian's head should have been. But Julian, anticipating the shift in the thermal updraft, had canted his rifle a fraction of an inch to the left just as he fired. Quinn's bullet didn't hit his skull, it slammed directly into the objective lens of his advanced rifle scope, shattering it into 1,000 pieces and violently whipping the heavy Chaitak out of his hands. The kinetic transfer was enough to drastically alter the trajectory of Julian's .408 solid. Down on the National Mall, the president had just opened his mouth to deliver the next line of his speech. Screech crash. Julian's massive 419-grain bullet, thrown entirely off its 1048-yard flight path, completely missed the commander-in-chief. Instead, it struck the reinforced polycarbonate teleprompter screen 3 feet to the president's left. The screen exploded in a shower of deadly, razor-sharp shrapnel. The crowd's cheer died in their throats, replaced instantly by the terrifying, deafening echo of the supersonic sonic boom rolling off the marble museums. Gun! 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 A Secret Service agent screamed over the radio. In less than a second, 4 agents tackled the president, burying him under a mountain of Kevlar-lined suit jackets. The pristine stage devolved into absolute chaos as the crowd realized they were in the kill zone. The roaring sea of patriots morphed into a stampede of sheer panic. Up in the mechanical room, Quinn quickly racked the bolt of the Mk-13, the spent brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and hitting the concrete floor with a metallic ping. She chambered a fresh round. POTUS is down but safe. Her mind registered the radio chatter. But Julian is still alive. 620 yards away, inside the dark belfry, Julian Vane was bleeding. Shards of his destroyed scope had peppered his cheek and forehead. But his heart rate didn't spike. He didn't panic. He was a creature of cold, mathematical logic. His shot had been ruined. His primary optic was destroyed. But the mission wasn't over. He looked at the torn hole in the black netting. He didn't need a computer to do the math. He reverse-engineered the trajectory in his head instantly. The angle of entry, the sound of the suppressed shot. 600 yards, west-northwest, the brutalist annex building. Julian reached down to his tactical rig and pulled out a backup optic. A ruggedized red dot sight mounted on an angled bracket attached to the side of his rifle chassis. It wasn't meant for extreme long range. But he wasn't shooting at the stage anymore. He was shooting at the ghost who had dared to interrupt his masterpiece. Quinn scanned the netting through her scope, looking for movement. Suddenly, a massive, unsuppressed muzzle flash lit up the inside of the church tower like a strobe light. Julian had ripped his suppressor off to reduce the length of his rifle for faster movement. Boom! The sound of the naked .408 Chaitak firing was apocalyptic. It sounded like a thunderbolt striking the DC pavement. Quinn didn't have time to flinch. The heavy armor-piercing solid crossed the distance in half a second. It didn't pass through the gap in the louver. It struck the heavy industrial aluminum slat directly in front of Quinn's face. The impact was devastating. The kinetic energy of the .408 round transferred into the metal, vaporizing the aluminum and blowing a massive crater into the concrete surrounding the vent. A storm of lethal spall, jagged pieces of metal and powdered concrete, blasted into the mechanical room. The shockwave picked Quinn up and threw her backward. She hit the steel casing of the elevator motor hard, the breath leaving her lungs in a violent rush. The heavy moving blanket collapsed on top of her. The room filled with thick, choking concrete dust. Ears ringing, vision swimming. Quinn tasted copper. Blood was pouring from a deep gash on her forehead where a piece of aluminum shrapnel had grazed her skull. Her left shoulder screamed in agony, dislocated from the impact against the motor. Stay down, her primal instincts begged her. You stopped the assassination. The Secret Service is swarming the area. It's over. But as she lay in the dust, gasping for air, the 1,000-yard stare returned. She didn't see the DC mechanical room. She saw Fallujah. She saw the little girl. She saw Julian walking away from the wreckage, ready to kill again another day. In the scope, there is no pain. Elias's voice whispered through the ringing in her ears. There is only the flight path. Quinn rolled onto her stomach, biting through her bottom lip to keep from screaming as she popped her left shoulder back into the socket with a sickening crunch. Blood dripped into her left eye, blinding it. She didn't care. She only needed her right eye to shoot. She crawled back to the blasted hole where the louvered vent used to be. She dragged the Mk-13 through the dust. The chassis was scratched, but the Nightforce optic was intact. She wedged the rifle back onto the sandbag. The air was thick with smoke and pulverized concrete. She wiped the blood from her face and pressed her eye to the glass. Julian had fired from a new position. He had moved from the right corner of the belfry to the left, taking advantage of the heavy stone pillars for cover. He was hunting her now. Quinn racked the bolt again, forcing a fresh .300 Win Mag round into the chamber. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash fighting against her willpower. She took a deep breath, sucking in the concrete dust, and forced her heart rate to slow. Beat, beat, pause. She found his silhouette in the shadows of the church tower. He was racking his massive bolt, preparing to fire the kill shot into her mechanical room. The duel wasn't over. It was just coming down to the final variable. Who had the will to hold the crosshairs steady while staring into the abyss? The silence that followed the destruction of the louvered vent was absolute. But it lasted only a fraction of a second. Then, the mechanical room came alive with a deafening, terrifying roar. Down in the lobby of the brutalist annex building, panic had set in. Civilians and security personnel were hammering the elevator call buttons. The massive, cylindrical elevator hoist motors bolted to the concrete floor around Quinn violently engaged. Heavy braided steel cables thick as a man's wrist whipped and snapped taut. Screaming over the massive spinning sheaves, the primary pulleys of the elevator system. The vibration shook the floor, rattling the bones in Quinn's jaw. The air was a thick, choking fog of vaporized concrete and aluminum spall. She lay on her stomach, her left arm screaming in agony from the relocated shoulder. Blood from her scalp matting her dark hair to her face. She was exposed. The hole in the wall was a gaping, jagged wound, offering no concealment. 620 yards away, Julian Vane was racking the massive bolt of his .408 Chaytak. He didn't have his primary optic, but with the vent blown wide open, he didn't need it. He just needed to put a 419-grain solid armor-piercing round into the center of the mechanical room. Quinn grabbed the heavy barrel of the Mk-13 Mod 7 and dragged herself backward, sliding her body across the dust-covered concrete. She threw herself behind the nearest elevator hoist machine. The base was a solid block of cast iron and steel, thick enough to stop even Julian's devastating rounds. Clang! A second unsuppressed .408 round tore through the DC skyline and slammed into the cast iron housing of the motor mere inches from Quinn's head. The impact rang out like a monstrous, cracked church bell. A shower of sparks rained down on her windbreaker, burning tiny holes in the synthetic fabric. Julian was walking his shots. He was using suppressive fire from a bolt-action rifle, a terrifying testament to his speed and mechanical mastery. Quinn pressed her back against the vibrating steel of the motor. Her breathing was ragged, tasting of copper and dust. The Secret Service would be triangulating Julian's unsuppressed muzzle flashes now. Helicopters would be swarming the airspace. Tactical teams would be breaching the stairwells of both buildings. She had less than 60 seconds before heavily armed men kicked down the door to her mechanical room. She looked at her Mk-13. The optic was covered in dust, but intact. She wiped the objective lens with a bloody thumb. She couldn't shoot around the side of the elevator motor. The angle to the church tower was blocked by the jagged concrete of the wall. There was only one way to take the shot. Quinn looked up at the massive, spinning sheave of the elevator hoist directly in front of her. The pulley wheel was 6 feet in diameter, constructed of heavy steel spokes. It was spinning rapidly as the elevator car plummeted toward the lobby. Between the thick steel spokes were gaps, moving windows of empty space no wider than a dinner plate, spinning at terrifying RPMs. It was an impossible shot. Firing a bullet through a rapidly rotating steel fan blade required a level of timing that bordered on the supernatural. If she fired a millisecond too late, her .300 Winchester Magnum bullet would strike the spinning steel spoke. At point-blank range, the ricochet would instantly kill her. The math, Quinn thought. forcing her mind to detach from the panic, the pain, and the noise. It always comes back to the math. She dragged her canvas shooting bag to the edge of the spinning sheave, resting the rifle barrel just inches from the blur of the rotating steel spokes. She welded her cheek to the stock and looked through the night force optic, focusing her vision through the spinning blur to the church tower 620 yards away. The strobe effect of the spinning spokes made her nauseous, but she forced her eye to track the target. Julian had stepped out from behind the 19th-century stone pillar of the belfry. He knew his time was up. He was standing completely exposed in the jagged tear of the debris netting, raising the massive Chaitak to his shoulder for a final, finishing shot. Through her optic, Quinn could see the cold, emotionless mask of his face. He wasn't a man, he was an algorithm calculating a firing solution. Quinn calculated her own. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at the spinning spokes. She found the rhythm. Thump, gap, thump, gap, thump, gap. The wheel was moving at a constant velocity. She began her breathing cycle, pulling the suffocating, dusty air deep into her lungs. The pain in her shoulder faded into a dull, distant hum. The deafening roar of the motors vanished. The world shrank to a single, illuminated red dot in the center of her reticle, dancing over Julian Vane's chest. Exhale. Hold. She placed her finger on the 1.2-pound trigger. She didn't anticipate the shot. She let her subconscious sync with the mechanical rhythm of the elevator sheave. Thump. Gap. Thump. Quinn squeezed the trigger. The Mk-13 roared, spitting a jet of fire. For a fraction of a microsecond, the 220-grain Sierra Matchking bullet existed in the chaotic space between the barrel and the spinning steel wheel. It threaded the needle perfectly, passing through the gap in the rotating spokes without so much as grazing the metal. The bullet broke the sound barrier, dragging a visible vapor trail of disturbed air out through the jagged hole in the wall. It crossed the urban canyon, 620 yards. In the belfry, Julian Vane's finger was tightening on his own trigger. He never got to pull it. Quinn's bullet struck him dead center in the sternum. The kinetic energy of the magnum round lifted the former Tier 1 operator off his feet. Snapping his rifle upward into the air, he was thrown backward violently, disappearing into the pitch-black shadows of the bell tower. Through her scope, Quinn watched the massive Chaitak M200 drop from the belfry, tumbling end over end for 150 feet before smashing into the construction scaffolding below. The ghost was dead. The math was final. Quinn lowered the rifle. Her hands, steady as stone for the last 6 hours, finally began to shake. A violent, uncontrollable tremor racked her body as the adrenaline drained away, leaving only exhaustion and pain. Suddenly, the staccato crack of suppressed 7.62 fire echoed across the city. The Secret Service counter-sniper teams had finally zeroed in on the church tower. They were pouring covering fire into the belfry, obliterating what was left of the debris netting. They were too late, but their arrival was Quinn's cue to leave. She didn't pack the Mk-13 back into its pristine Pelican case. There was no time. She broke the rifle down into its 3 main components, chassis, bolt, and suppressor, and shoved them into the blood-stained JanSport backpack. She grabbed her Kestrel, kicked the spent brass casing into the dark recess beneath the elevator motor, and stood up. The room spun wildly, but she caught herself against the wall. Heavy, tactical footsteps were echoing in the concrete stairwell. First floor, second floor, moving fast. Quinn pulled her Washington Nationals baseball cap low over her bleeding forehead. She slipped out of the mechanical room, bypassed the main stairwell, and ducked into the narrow, unlit maintenance shaft used by the janitorial staff. As SWAT teams breached the 12th floor with flashbangs and shouted commands, Spectre melted into the shadows of the building's subterranean levels. She was a phantom, walking away from the 1,000-yard truth she had just delivered, disappearing back into a world that would never know her name. 2 weeks had passed since Memorial Day. The 24-hour news cycle in America is a relentless machine, chewing up tragedies and spitting out sanitized narratives. The official story, broadcasted across every network from CNN to Fox News, was neat and digestible, alone, Deranged gunmen with a high-powered rifle had attempted to assassinate the president from an abandoned bell tower. However, thanks to the swift, heroic actions of the Secret Service counter-sniper teams who engaged the suspect, the threat was neutralized before a single shot could hit the stage. The nation mourned the shattered teleprompter. Parades were thrown for the agents in the presidential detail. Medals were quietly pinned on the chests of the men who fired the suppressing shots into the belfry. Sitting in a vinyl booth at a rundown diner somewhere off Interstate 90 in Wyoming, Quinn Vance watched the muted television above the pie display. She wore a faded flannel shirt and her trademark Washington Nationals cap, pulled low to cover the butterfly bandages holding the jagged laceration on her forehead together. Her left arm rested in a black medical sling. She stirred her black coffee with her right hand, her face completely unreadable. She didn't feel cheated. She didn't want the medals, the parades, or the recognition. Glory was a heavy, dangerous thing. It belonged to the politicians and the people in the light. Spectre belonged to the shadows. The conspiracy, the shadow consortium that had hired Julian, was quietly imploding. Without their apex predator, and with the FBI tearing through Aegis Security's compromised servers following an anonymous, highly encrypted data dump from a certain ballistics consultant, the architects of the plot were scurrying back under their rocks. Quinn finished her coffee, dropped a $5 bill on the Formica table, and walked out into the crisp mountain air. 12 hours later, her dusty Chevy Tahoe crunched up a freshly graded dirt road in the Montana Badlands. The charred, blackened foundation of Elias Thorne's cabin was a stark scar against the snowy earth. But right next to it sat a gleaming, vintage Airstream trailer. Elias was sitting in a canvas lawn chair outside the trailer, a thick wool blanket over his legs and his left arm encased in a heavy fiberglass cast. He was smoking a cheap cigar, watching the sun dip below the jagged limestone peaks. Quinn parked the truck, grabbed a heavy, olive-drab Pelican case from the backseat, and walked over to him. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of wild sage, but the sharp bite of cordite was gone. She set the case down in the dirt at Elias's feet and popped the 4 heavy latches. Inside, the Mk13 Mod 7 lay in its custom-cut foam. It wasn't the dust-choked, blood-stained weapon she had carried out of the brutalist annex building in D.C. It had been meticulously stripped, ultrasonically cleaned, oiled, and reassembled. The barrel was spotless. The Nightforce optic was perfectly zeroed. Elias looked down at the rifle, then looked up at Quinn. His weathered eyes traced the bandage on her head and the sling on her arm. He didn't ask how close it had been. He knew the math. He knew the 1,000-yard truth. "Action is smooth?" Elias asked, his voice rough as gravel. "Glass smooth, Master Chief," Quinn replied softly. "She shoots exactly where she looks." Elias nodded slowly, taking a long drag from his cigar. "Vain? He's a statistic," Quinn said, her voice devoid of malice or triumph. It was simply a statement of fact. The ghost had been exorcised. She looked out over the vast, empty expanse of the Badlands. The silence out here was different now. For years, the quiet had been a canvas where her mind painted nightmares of Fallujah. She had come to Montana to hide from the little girl on the balcony, to bury her trauma in the cold, unfeeling equations of ballistics. "You see in them, kid?" Elias asked gently, following her gaze. "The ghosts?" Quinn closed her eyes. She waited for the phantom smell of burning diesel. She waited for the terror. But it didn't come. Instead, she saw the National Mall. She saw the sea of humanity, fathers, mothers, veterans, children, standing under the American flags. She saw the Secret Service agents throwing their bodies over the commander-in-chief. She saw the lives that continued because she had chosen to step back into the fire. The little girl in Fallujah wasn't screaming anymore. The memory was still there, it would always be there. A permanent scar on her soul, but the crushing weight of the guilt had finally lifted. She hadn't just taken a life in that mechanical room. She had saved thousands. Quinn opened her eyes and looked at her old mentor. A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth for the first time in years. "No, Elias," she whispered, the wind catching her words. "The scope is clear. Elias chuckled, a warm sound that fought against the cold Montana air. He reached out with his good hand and snapped the pelican case shut. Good, the old armorer said, because the world is a dangerous place. Spectre. And there will always be wolves. Quinn looked up at the darkening sky. The first stars beginning to pierce the twilight. She was broken, scarred, and completely anonymous to the country she had sworn to protect. And she wouldn't have it any other way. Some heroes are forged in the light. Their names etched in marble for the world to see. But the ones who keep the darkness at bay, they're just a whisper in the wind at 1,000 yards.